Inspired by Lizzy Borden's ruthless murder of her mother, James Cushing vandalized the upscale neighborhood of Queen Anne, Seattle, Washington, between March and August 1990. His story is chilling and terrifying. James enjoyed murdering strangers and knew no fear. It all started from his childhood. James's murder spree had an unsettling history. James was troubled even before birth. While pregnant, his mother was inflicted with German measles, resulting in cognitive impairments within James. He was always slower than the rest, more troubled and angrier. His parents' divorce and father's abandonment at the young age of 13 only heightened his neurotic insecurities. However, none could imagine it would translate into him becoming a cold-blooded murderer. Most divorcee kids are troubled, but none so much that they set a neighbor's drapes and sofa on fire. That is precisely what James did. It eventually led to the heartbroken mother sending off James to a halfway house in their Seattle neighborhood. The halfway house only made James spiral more. The slightest change within the staff set him off, leading him to break windows at night. It culminated in, once again, setting fire to the building. James was arrested, and his fingerprints fed into the system. Little could have anyone imagined that this would be key to solving his murder spree later. Despite such dangerous behavior, the halfway house wanted to do away with James when he turned 21. They let him out, with no way to fend for himself and zero capacity to earn a living. James wandered on the streets, sleeping on benches. His mental health deteriorated, and his anger worsened. Credit goes to his ever-loving mother, who summed up her meager resources to find James and took him in. She knew her son was troubled but couldn't have imagined how much. James's mental health had deteriorated to the extent that he'd started hearing voices. These voices told him to kill, and he detested his mother's inevitable constant supervision. As revenge, he would slash her furniture, throw garbage all over the house and constantly cook up conspiracies with the voices in his head. This was all turning dangerous. It reached the tipping point with watching the movie Legends of Lizzy Borden. Like him, Lizzy Borden hated her stepmother, a true story from the 1890s. She had eventually axed down her mother in revenge. Watching the movie was a transcendental experience for James. Everything made sense now. This was the way to gain control over his life. Lizzy stripped herself naked before murdering her stepmother. James, too, resorted to the same method. After all, it made sense not to have the blood splattered on his clothes. However, almost 100 years later, the crime didn't work out the same way. While James was hovering over his mother with a knife, naked and ready to kill her, she woke up and screamed for her life. Disoriented, James ran away. His mother was bewildered and frightened beyond imagination. She loved her child, dedicated the more significant part of her daily routine to taking care of him, and this was the result? She pleaded to the state for help the next day and eventually admitted him to a mental facility. However, true to the state's neglectful attitude, James escaped and wandered the streets again. He ultimately landed in Queen Anne, a rich neighborhood in Seattle, Washington. No one could imagine the wreckage he'd leave the town in. On March 8, 1990, James stole an axe from the DeBarros residence and, just a few days later, on March 13, used it to commit a heinous crime. Geneva McDonald was a 63-year-old avid gardener who forgot to lock her house that day. Apparently, that was enough to make her the first victim of James's cruel murder spree. He went inside and used the axe to slash her face. Blood gushed out of Geneva's body, as James relentlessly kept stabbing the life out of her. Later on, James narrated the crime, saying, "I walked upstairs, I took the axe. I think she rolled over. I just said, 'Jesus Christ,' I got excited, I just took it over my head and went wham." True to Lizzy Borden's profile, he used a nearby scissor to slash her body further up and had a good meal before exiting the house. He even laid down in the guest room for a short nap before leaving the house. The Queen Anne residents were shocked and scared out of their wits. No one knew the identity of this man and had no idea who his next target would be. James kept spreading fear in the neighborhood. His next target was Ian Warren. On June 17, Ian Warren was sleeping over at a friend's house in the area after consuming too much beer. He was just getting ready for bed when James launched at him with a knife and stabbed him relentlessly. Unlike Geneva, Ian could fight back. James was shocked, since he never expected his victims to intimidate him in return. He ran away. Word further spread in the neighborhood, as every man, woman and child looked over their shoulder more. They all started going out less and double-checking their logs. The police were also frustrated since the carless James would leave partial footprints at all these locations, but none that could be used to locate his identity. It is also so much harder to catch a homeless man. However, the breakthrough came when they chanced on his fingerprints from the group home fire and connected the pieces. All Seattle personnel were employed to find out the man behind the crime. They finally were able to track him down at the local diner on September 13, 1990. As he was arrested, James was nonplussed. He had enjoyed the fame and fear. It made him feel in control. His only words, when arrested, were, "I'm not going to have to sleep outside, would I?" James Cushing remains incarcerated at the Monroe Correctional Complex in Monroe, Washington.